Since 2012, Landon Kendricks has been a licensed grade 4 wastewater operator in the water and wastewater field in Massachusetts. He's worked predominantly in reclaimed water facilities, wastewater facilities, and CSO, with a focus on preventative maintenance, prolonging the usable life of critical assets, and increasing operational efficiency through a standardization of work process, as well as implementation of new technologies. Landon currently works for Rockwell Automation, focusing on water, wastewater, and infrastructure within the customer base and plants in his region of upstate New York and New England. His focus is primarily around the Industrial Internet of Things, or IIoT, and smart water wastewater plants. And then our other expert today is Dave Gutshaw. Dave has 2 decades of industry experience in global manufacturing and information technology across a multitude of disciplines, including network engineering, assembly operations, IT operations, and technology solutions sales. With Cisco, Dave is the IoT, Internet of Things, manufacturing sales leader, focusing his efforts around the digital transformation of infrastructure and industrial facilities across the Eastern US. So we're going to get started. And as I said, for those who have just joined, if you have questions, please enter them in the chat function or hold them to the end, and we'll get around to as many of those as we can. So, Landon, what's the biggest problem you're seeing in the water and wastewater industry today?
It's you could point to a lot of different things. In water, wastewater, as an operator, we always like to think of ourselves as firefighters. We're always asked to be doing more with less resources. Dealing with older infrastructure is a big problem. Obviously, with COVID-19, issues with future funding of bigger projects is obviously a big problem that we're seeing within the industry coming up. But one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now is the skills gap. What you have going on right now is you've had operators who have been working in facilities for 15, 20, 25 years who are coming to that age of retirement. And what you're not seeing is a whole lot of backfill coming into this industry. You don't have a whole lot of younger operators coming in to learn from some of those older experienced operators. And what you're seeing right now is you're needing technology to sort of fill that gap between the institutionalized knowledge that you're losing when some of those older, more experienced operators retire, to when you have some of the younger, less experienced operators, coming in who might be more adept with technology, but don't have the same sort of mechanical know-how or know-how of the processes and of how the facilities actually work and run. So the skills gap, major issue that we're seeing.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Dave, so with this skills gap, from Cisco's perspective, what does it really mean?
Yeah, great question. So, if you think about it, right, we've kind of always had, I'm going to call it 2 potential ways of, I'm going to call it operating networks, right? So, Cisco's a networking company, so we see everything through this network lens. And so, in IT, let's say an incident or an emergency, we'll call it a P1 incident, might mean a response time of 15 minutes. In the process space, a P1 might be right now. There is no delay. Pick up a radio and call somebody over because we have an asset down. And so what's happening is we are seeing customers try and essentially fill this skills gap by, okay, bringing potentially somebody from an IT area into the process area and expecting them to sort of automatically understand what that means. It might also mean, especially in this COVID world, you might have an air gap network that was fine before, and now you decide, well, the only way to remotely access that network is to connect it. And so now the minute that air gap network is there, that introduces, as you know, a whole host of things, because most likely that air gap network contains assets that are, unpatchable, unknowable. The OEM no longer makes it, et cetera. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that you've got folks leaving that no longer understand the process side. We're trying to fill them with, let's say, IT skills folks. And on top of it, we're now connecting networks that were previously not connected.
Got it. Okay. So if I can follow on to that, Dave, so connecting all those assets really gets back to the skills gap, right? Because if you have all your tribal knowledge and the people who have grown up with the system leaving through retirement or whatever the case might be, how do you bring new people in who don't have that hands-on knowledge?
Yeah, it's an absolute common problem, right? I mean, coming from manufacturing, one of the things that was very common was, folks, operators would know their machine by the way it sounds, but the way it feels. Like, look, I know the HMI is saying it's green, dude, but there's a problem here. I can tell. It doesn't sound like it normally does. And so that tribal knowledge walking out of the door, it's a big problem. And then you combine it with, again, trying to bring, let's say, IT folks over and OT folks on the other side. And so it really, we've been talking a long time about IT-OT convergence, but the reality is it's not just about the technologies, right? This is a culture thing. You're not going to automatically, get a 20-year IT vet. They're not automatically on day one going to understand the criticalities of running a process network, or running a process, connecting assets there. So just putting folks in the same place, having IT and OT personnel build relationships. Don't start as much on the skills side and the education side, and begin just on kind of putting humans in the same group. With COVID, it's a little harder, right? In some cases, you might have originally put them, let's say, in the same process area, but now it's about just having team members, creating cross-functional teams with both process folks and IT folks, process folks in other areas of the business. People will learn by osmosis. They'll learn as they become friends and become work and outside of work colleagues. So it's about both places, right? IT really understands change control and the underlying technologies. Your process folks obviously understand the business. They understand the criticality, and it's really about training kind of on both sides.
And to your point about there being a culture that needs to be learned, and perhaps the culture changing over time with new employees, Landon, from a tactical perspective, are you seeing operators embrace this idea of cross-training and working with IT resources to teach them the OT skill sets?
So yes and no. So what you're seeing with the water, wastewater industry as a whole, you really talk about some of the structural things that we're dealing with right now. So the average water, wastewater operator here in America is 50 years old and tend to have somewhere between 12 and 18 years of experience. So they got in this industry, a lot of times before you see a lot of the technology, the SCADA systems, the CMM, computerized maintenance management systems, things of that nature. You see a lot of people who came into the industry where there's a lot of, pushing buttons and turning valves and manually taking readings and things like that. And you see a lot of operators that have a lot of experience, they have a comfort level with that. And, just like human nature, you have that old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, I don't necessarily believe that. I think that you do see some operators who have been in the field for a considerable amount of time who have been encouraged and been motivated to do some of that cross training with the IT and OT with the IT resources and sort of trading skill sets. Some operators, what you've seen, they might be, inching towards retirement, might be a year or two away, where you really haven't seen them sort of, make that big leap in adopting this new technology because they feel as though that it's not really going to affect them that much because they're not going to be in the field very much longer. So when you're really talking about, who's really, embracing, this idea, it is those few younger operators who don't necessarily have the process skills. We talk about that tribal, that institutionalized knowledge that some of the older operators do have. The younger operators need data. They need technology to sort of compensate for that lack of institutionalized knowledge. And you see those are the ones who are usually more willing to do some of that crossover training, to be more engaged in learning about, the SCADA systems or the network architecture or the asset management systems and things of that nature. So with a little bit of a younger infusion of bodies into the industry, you are seeing a little bit more crossover.
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear that, because as technology in the various plants either gets modernized or recently has been or soon will be, it's not just a gap between knowing how we've done things forever, but with a younger group of new employees coming into these facilities, they have to learn how we've done things, but also how we're doing things going forward, given the modernization efforts that's bringing in new technology.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
Dave, go ahead.
Absolutely. And this field is becoming significantly more data driven. It's everything is going to analytics now. It's, how much does processing, a gallon of water, cost the city? How can we be more operationally efficient? How do we save on chemicals? How do we run the plant more efficiently in this COVID, environment? And so, we're getting that, we're asking our operators nowadays to be, less like we talked about, valve turners and button pushers, and we're asking them to be more data analysts, and you're looking for that expertise on how the facility runs the best, and being able to have, smarter technology and that can give us more data to analyze, makes that operator knowledge and that analyst portion of their job even more important as it goes into the future.
That's interesting, Landon. So Dave, from your experience, this, as you said, dealing with a skills gap this isn't the first time you've encountered this in your career. And to Landon's point about the data centricity of what these operations are today and what they're going to require going forward, how do you see bridging the skills gap between not only the process areas with the operators, but between that and the IT areas who really don't understand the processes historically?
Yeah. What wonderful question. I mean, I think the first thing for everyone to recognize is that, and I touched on it a bit ago. Culture. This is a culture gap as much as it is a skills gap. folks on the IT side, let's say, come to work in one set of one type of clothes on a regular basis. Folks in the process area might have PPE on some days that, other days they might not. I'm going to call it work start and stop times tend to be different. IT tends to be able to have sort of a, kind of carve it out based upon their wake cycle. Whereas, process folks, look, you're at a mercy of the process. If you're a morning person and the process shift is morning, that's great. They happen to line up. If you're not a morning person, tough darts. And so this is very much about culture. And so what that means is that this idea that you can throw folks into a cross-functional training and come out 2 weeks later and have the big light bulb go on and go, okay, I get it. I'm good. Perfect. No. No, this is like the earliest thing in an organization that an organization should do is address the culture gap. And what I mean by that is before you even know what the technology is going to look like, before you know what you're going to buy, before you know what you're going to connect, before you know what the connectivity, the dashboards look like, before you understand any of that, is start addressing kind of the culture stuff early. Say, hey, look, in your daily huddles with the process folks and their IT support staff, say, look, there's going to be a lot more of you guys eventually working together. Would love for you to begin to, maybe spend 30 to 60 minutes of your day in either camp. Go look and ask questions. Be curious about how the process area works. On the flip, right? Go and find out why IT feels like they need 67 documents signed off in triplicate before they make a change in the data center that always seems to impact our operation anyway, right? Right? Get real curious about, and the earlier you start, the better. But you specifically asked the question about my past life, and I kind of touched on it earlier in my one answer, and that is, it's crazy what happens when you get humans together. And so the more what I'll call ways of being able to get folks together, informal, formal, working in the same areas, working in the same group, working in the same team, the more of that happens on a long enough time period, that will absolutely pay dividends. Up to and including, putting what I'll call cube farms and desks or workstations within the same proximities, 6 feet away, if that's what you want to do. Just that alone can help because, humans do funny things. On day one, they're like, who the heck's that guy? On day 30, that's, hey, my name's Bob. Hey, my name's Jane. On day 60 and 90, once the bars open back up, they're going to be taking one another back out to the pubs. So it's, humans do funny things when they're stuck in the same place.
Absolutely. That's a really good observation. So thanks, Dave. I appreciate that insight. So let's switch gears a little bit here. Dave, you made the reference to, I'll extrapolate from your comments of desks 6 feet apart or whatever. And let me ask you, Landon, how has the coronavirus pandemic or COVID-19 affected the water and wastewater business in your mind?
It's huge. This coronavirus, this COVID-19 has affected the water wastewater industry in every way possible. They're doing research and testing the water to try and find clusters of the coronavirus in particular communities. You can find traces of the coronavirus in wastewater. So there's amazing things and studies being done with that. You're seeing it in the way that water and wastewater treatment plants are staffed and making sure that you're keeping a distance from people that you work with. Schedules are being staggered. The way that you do work, the way that you're supposed to send crews out there, the PPE that is issued, remote operations, things that you would think were going to be years in the future for your municipality, your township, are coming here today out of necessity for the safety of your employees. sort of going back to the scheduling and how we work. So my background, so I was a water wastewater operator for about 7 years, up until about a year and a half ago. I worked for an engineering firm that did that, contract operations. I know it's almost like a four-letter word for people that work in towns and municipalities. But we ran, treatment plants, and the cities and towns or authorities would pay, us, our group, to run these facilities and be responsible for maintaining the equipment and, maintaining permit and things like that. So coming from running a municipality, but coming from it from the private side, it was of utmost importance to them that the operation itself was running correctly, but is also running as efficiently as possible. So what I'm seeing right now are things that contract operations had adopted, a couple of, years ago, that now you're seeing municipalities having to adopt. Things like remote operations are particularly important. I used to work a noon to midnight shift at a combined stormwater overflow or combined sewer overflow. And I worked alone for the last 9 hours of the shift, and the person that worked after me worked alone for the next 6 hours of the shift. But if we had inclement weather or we had issues at a pump station and we didn't know what to do and we needed, information, it's not efficient to simply call in, the chief operator or the plant manager and have him drive in, whether he might live 45 minutes away, drive in, investigate, see what's going on, see it could be a simple issue, and then drive back. Well, in the contract operations world, that is bare minimum. It's going to be 4 hours of his time and 4 hours that you have to pay him overtime because he has to come in and do that investigation. So instead, what they chose to do is now you have remote access. Now you can see the SCADA system and all the comings and goings of the facility from a tablet or a laptop. So instead of, hey, gosh, this pump went down and we don't know why, now you can look at, connected assets and look on that network and say, oh, geez, well, looking at this, this Ethernet enabled overload relay, this thing tripped off on high amperage, bearings might be shot, within that motor, and that's why this went down. We can, run this other pump full tilt boogie, until the next day where we can have somebody come in and fix it or replace it or whatever the case may be. But now he's able to do that from his own home, in his home office, instead of, running the risk of coming out in a storm or something like that. So you can sort of see how this relates to now this environment where we're keeping a distance from people, where you might have had a staff of 5 or 6 people working all at one time, and now you're having that same 5 or 6 people staggered, 5 or 6 hour shifts throughout the day and throughout the week. Well, because of remote access, now you can have somebody who might have a little bit more experience help out somebody who has less experience, because they can go into the network and see, what's going on with the facilities or what's going on with the remote pump stations without actually physically being there. And so this way of thinking, this way of being able to remote in, but even, going to a further example, well, let's say that, you have limited labor resources to start with, and, plants are typically running 24/7, and somebody comes down with, COVID and they're out. Well, is your facility prepared to be able to run unattended? And, that's with having the smarter technology and the connected assets, where you'd even be able to think about running your facility unattended for 8 hours or for 16 hours. There's many plants here in New England, that were early adopters of having these connected assets where they run unattended, 16 hours a day and all weekend. You have operators that work Monday through Friday, 6 to 2, and that's it. And the rest of the time it's unattended. If there's alarms, people have tablets, people have cell phones, they can monitor their facility remotely. this is sort of the future of operations. And what you're seeing is the coronavirus is just sort of bringing it to us right to our front door quicker than maybe some people initially anticipated. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I will tell you that remote access is important. It sounds wonderful. There are all sorts of advantages, but I'm sure I'm not the only person on this call this afternoon whose mind immediately goes to, yeah, but I'm not sure that I trust the security. And so I'm going to shift it over to you, Dave. With network security issues, I know that Rockwell Automation, I know that Cisco are working on improving security. Department of Homeland Security watches infrastructure facilities like water and wastewater facilities very closely for any ingress by unsavory characters, I'll say. So can you talk a little bit, Dave, about what Cisco's doing in the network security space, water, wastewater, infrastructure, et cetera?
Yeah, sure. So great question, and it's interesting. I'll tack on to what Landon said about remote ops, right? We've talked a lot for years about the capability that the network can bring to remote operations, but there was never a compelling event. It was always, well, yeah, but I'll just air gap it and keep those things locally connected, and that'll get rid of the security concerns, or at least lessen them. Well, now with COVID, and oh, by the way, the cost savings and the time savings, to Landon's point about no longer running a resource 4 hours out and 4 hours back, now all of a sudden there's enough of a compelling reason to say, okay, let's investigate the kind of remote access scenarios and how do we connect these networks that, let's say, used to be air gapped. So the good news is, Cisco and Rockwell have been looking at this for a long time. It just was not really, I'm going to call it the big compelling event. So that really forced everybody's hand in looking at it. So whether you're talking, so let's take the converged plant-wide Ethernet architecture. This converged plant-wide Ethernet architecture is a joint architecture between Cisco and Rockwell. We jointly developed it, started over a decade ago, and really you can think of it like the initial blueprint of a house, right? Before you start getting into, I want the garage bigger, or I want, want an extra bedroom, there's this like base blueprint that you base everything off of. That converged plant-wide Ethernet is 100% designed with security in mind. And it's designed with the security in mind of legacy networks as well. And that's what I want to key on, is that there's a recognition that a lot of times these assets, that it's not just that it's, to your point, right, bad actors. It's also, I'm going to call it mistakes. So think about a remote operation scenario. You have someone that is, let's say, connecting remotely to two things. They both look fairly identical. The problem is that the only difference between the two is one's like labeled left and one's that's labeled right. But otherwise, the ladder logic on down is essentially identical. You can have a perfectly, I'll call it trained and enabled resource that might go into the, I'll call it the one on the right when they wanted to go into the one on the left. Which is why we have, things like lockout, tagout, and other scenarios. But the idea is that when you design the network from the ground up, and you have visibility into what's going on, and you understand what a good baseline is, and you're always essentially looking for deviations from the baseline. CPWE and Cisco, we have solutions that can 100% help here. And so it's about all of the factors, right? It's about being able to get your arms around and understand what connecting to that legacy network means. It's about keeping the bad guys out and ensuring that only the right, the folks that have accounts and allowances for it can get access to that remotely. It's about understanding how somebody could potentially just make a mistake, and let's catch it and not allow it if it's a behavior that's, let's say, inside of I'll call it traditional operation hours. It's about tying things together to say, hey, if the pump is running, just like the value of the pump running bit is set high, don't allow someone to actually put the controller in program mode, right? There's things that we can do that can essentially get our arms around not just malicious activity, but legacy networks, mistakes, and enable someone potentially to look at, see, and help things remotely. Great question.
Interesting. Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for that really comprehensive response. So talking, more still, I guess, on the security thread, I am familiar with the American Water Infrastructure Act. Landon, does that address security beyond just network security?
Oh, absolutely. So the American Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, looked to address a couple different things. So the things they really focus on was risk, resilience, and cybersecurity. And one of the things that they really looked at is there is more intelligent and smart infrastructure out there, but that also means that there is that they're more of a escalating threat and target for malevolent, actors out there. So one of the things that when you look at now, so the American Water Infrastructure Act was made for specifically for address water utilities, but and the mandates are specifically for water utilities. But a lot of these things also relate to wastewater utilities as well, because a lot of these systems, depending on the municipality, are connected. So when you're looking at what a utility, water or wastewater utility must assess, you're looking at malevolent acts and natural hazards. So you're talking about resilience of pipes, construction conveyances, physical barriers, source water, water collection, intake, pretreatment, treatment, storage, distribution, electronic, computer, and other automated systems, i.e. could be your SCADA system. There's monitoring practices of the systems. You're looking at the financial infrastructure of the systems. It could be the use, the storage, and handling of your chemicals. It's also the operation and maintenance of the system. And, this assessment could also include an evaluation of capital and operational needs for risk and resilience. So, what does that word resilience really mean? It means the ability of a community water system or an asset of a community water system to adapt or withstand effects of malevolent acts. Or if the function is interrupted, to rapidly return to a normal operation. That talks about both, cyber security, hazards, as well as physical hazards. And people ask, what does this really mean? What is an example of why the American Water Infrastructure Act was really created? And think about this: if you're a water treatment plant, and you are meant to have a chlorine residual of a couple of parts per million or 2 milligrams coming out of your plant, and let's say your SCADA system says everything is running correctly, you have your correct residual that you're seeing at your booster stations where those are being tested. But if somebody is hacked into your system and was able to keep the value of your chlorine residual appearing the same to you, but ramps up the chlorine levels to where instead of having a couple of parts per million, now you're looking at 20 parts per million. Now you have the potential to poison a whole community. And this is, these are some of these malevolent acts from people who this is, it's a terrorist act. This is why Congress, created and passed this American Water Infrastructure Act. It's not just people, hijacking, monetary systems or holding hostage, communities for, Bitcoin and things like that. There are actually, physical hazards and threats to a community that this act was made to really go over and discuss and really assess. And so one of the things that was mandated, with this act is every community, that serves more than 3,300 people has to have an emergency response plan. And there's some specific dates, and if people have questions about this, I can actually send out a PowerPoint to discuss this. But there's this emergency response plan has to have strategies and resources to improve the resiliency of the system, including physical security and cybersecurity of the systems. There has to be included plans and procedures that can be implemented, identification of equipment that can be utilized, and in the event of malevolent acts or natural hazards that threaten the ability of the community water system to deliver safe drinking water. So these emergency response plans have to address all of these, and they have to be certified. And so, they worked with the American Water Works Association to come up with these standards. Now, there are some deadlines that have already passed. There's some deadlines that are coming up. But they're, for communities, for water systems that serve more than 100,000 people, there's a deadline about 5 months ago, March 31st, 2020, where there has to be, the beginnings, something on paper where you have your emergency response plans. For communities 50,000 to 100,000, it's December 31st of 2020, you have to have emergency response plan, something on paper that people can see. And about 6 months after that, it has to be certified that this plan can be implemented. This means working with engineering firms. This means working with consultants and really discussing the resiliency, of the system. There's more than one way to skin a cat, but there's American Water Works Association standards, as well as WARN standards and guidelines and resources to how you can come up with a emergency response plan for your community. If you have more questions about it, we can discuss this at a later time. It's really important, and a lot of people invested a lot of time and money in making sure that this goes off, because with the smarter technology that you have, when we're able to have things like remote access, it gives us more ability, but it also puts a target on municipalities' backs as well, that we want to make sure that we're addressing and doing these things the safe way, because there's no going back. There's no going back to the era of just turning valves and pushing buttons and having just old relays. We're not going back to that. You can't. But with this new technology, it's a matter of implementing this technology intelligently and with a plan, and making sure that all the security is in place in order to do it correctly. So sorry, it's a little bit of a long-winded answer, but the American Water Infrastructure Act 2018 has a lot of different components of it.
Thanks, Landon. That was a big help. Thank you. I appreciate it. So Dave, if it's not just from a Cisco and ITOT perspective, if it's not just about network security, if it's also about data security and physical security, how does Cisco play in that?
Dave, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for that. Yes. That's the longest pause we've had on the call, right?
Right.
Yeah. Great question, right? So everybody's definition of security is different. So when we say we have to care, we say the word security. Are we talking network security? Are we talking data security and physical security, like you mentioned? So the question really is, what is Cisco doing here? So I'll go back first of all. So I'll touch on data security first. we are still, we're absolutely still the, I'm going to call it the #1 networking company worldwide. We've been connecting the unconnected at Cisco for 3+ decades. We know networks fundamentally, I'm going to say, better than anybody else in the business, which is why, partnering with such a strong controls vendor like Rockwell, is a big deal. Because we know the network really well. Rockwell knows the control side very well. And so, data integrity, there is a lot of pieces under the covers around data integrity. That our goal is to what I'm going to call translate that data or transport that data from point A to point B agnostically, without regard to vendor. Because you've got all sorts of different vendors of various different pieces of equipment, and you want the data, whether it's originating from vendor A, getting there in the same timely fashion as vendor B. When we think about data integrity and security, it's baked into the infrastructure that we build. So down to things like we have chipsets in our hardware that essentially ensure that a foreign actor, can't, I'm going to call it a supply chain middleman, can't essentially, I'm going to call it, take a Cisco box, a genuine Cisco box, and ensure that code on that hardware doesn't essentially get manipulated in the middle of the supply chain. So we have data integrity very much at the core from manufacturing on up. So then it gets into things like, okay, CPWE has segmentation at its core. So one of the very first steps in understanding, okay, getting our arms around it is really about that segmentation. And so we have technologies that enable, the old days it was the only way to segment is now you're changing addressing, and I've got this old legacy flat network and I'd love to segment it, but it requires a lot of IP changes. No, we have technologies that will enable you to help segment and provide those, I'm going to call it, places in the network where you can get better visibility and understanding of what's going on without changing a single address. So, being able to do that and then provide kind of visibility across, regardless of, again, the maker of the device, I think those things are very much at the heart of what Cisco does. And then being able to, again, I touched on it earlier, being able to ensure that, again, I'm going to call it the person that's actually accessing that network remotely in this post-COVID, 2020 world. Is a person that is trusted, but at the end of the day, we're still going to watch and get visibility into what specifically they're changing, so that if it deviates from the baseline, we're not going to allow that to occur. And then on the physical security front, I think the best way to describe it is, Cisco, we certainly have some physical security products from, cameras to similar, but we're very much, again, we're device agnostic. So we can, in a single switch platform, provide all kinds of different traffic configurations inside of our quality of service policies that are designed to both, I'm going to call it, ensure that the very small but very critical control packet gets to where it's going, as well as the much fatter, potentially a little less important, but certainly in bulk very important, video traffic gets where it's going. And we're going to be able to treat those different traffic types the way they need to be treated. Again, all inside of potentially single platforms, so that you can physically connect, whether it be a camera or a control system, to maybe a physical piece of equipment, but continue to ensure that they're 100% logically separated if it's not a vision system or similar. So I think I touched on all parts of that question. If I didn't, let me know.
No, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Dave. I really appreciate the thoughtful responses for both you and Landon this afternoon. So those are the topics I wanted to touch on. Really, really appreciate Dave and Landon spending some time with us this afternoon. And I wanted to make sure not to use all the time that was available to us during this hour just on my questions, but I'd like to open it up for anyone who is on the meeting today to either just verbalize your questions, or if you'd prefer to use the chat, feel free to do so. I've got another 10 minutes or almost 15 minutes if you'd like to use it to ask the questions of either one of our panel members. The questions don't have to be related specifically to the topics that I ask questions about. Other topics related to either the Rockwell piece or the Cisco piece would be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, literally, right. I think both of us have got a lot of experience, both on the, process side, a lot of, bought a background across a lot of different companies. So, yeah, we're yours for the next 12 minutes. Whatever's on your mind.
Well, okay. So I do have a couple closing comments, which will give you a couple of moments to gather any questions you might have. So thanks for joining us first and foremost. The intent here was to essentially begin a conversation around the evolution that's going on in the water and wastewater business, really critical infrastructure overall. I know personally that there are a lot of water and wastewater plants in Western New York that still have technology that was installed back in the last century. And yes, it works today. If it's Rockwell, it was built like a tank and they work over the long term. But the reality is that when you do have a failure, if that item is no longer produced, it could end up being a significant outage, which you can't afford to do. And more importantly, the advantages that in the utility that's available in current generation technology, as opposed to what you might have in place today, can make your jobs easier, can help you when it comes to tracking and tracing, when it comes to reporting to DEC, when it comes to all the various aspects of your job that are critical today that back when the system was installed back in the 1980s may not have been such an important task. And the combination of Rockwell and Cisco and Rexel in Western New York stand ready to help you by answering questions, which is what we were doing today, is answering some questions that may have been in areas of interest. If you deal with this, you already know that we have a whole crew of specialists in Western New York. We're here ready, willing, and able to help you out. And between the three companies, we've got a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, and we can help you migrate from what you have that was installed literally back in the 1980s to what's available today. And we can actually help lay out for you what a migration or modernization path might look like. It's part of what we do for you. You're no doubt aware of that. So I'm going to change the slide one more time here. If you have questions, if you would like further information, if you're looking for somebody, a contact at Rexel, please feel free to reach out to either myself, Bill Griffith, or John Conway. John sent the invite out, so you've got his contact info already. John is our automation manager in Western New York. And as I said, I lead the business in Western New York. We have a great team and we're here to work with you and help you out, answer your questions, and frankly, make your jobs easier and hopefully make them more enjoyable. So one last, go ahead.
So Bill, I got a couple of a question or so. one of the first questions that was addressed to me is, what I thought one of the biggest problems that I was seeing in the water wastewater industry. Since we have some more, industry experts on the line, I guess I want some feedback from you guys. What are some of the biggest issues that you guys are seeing out there? I've been sort of removed from the plant for about, 16, 18 months now. What are you guys seeing out there in the field?
If you're trying to answer, Landon, I can see that everyone except the three of us are on mute. So if you're asking a question and not getting a response, it could be that.
Yeah, no, feel free to take you guys off of mute. So everything in the industry is great?
Yeah, a lot of quiet folks. It's all good. I been on enough webinars in my day that yes, sometimes you're trying to operate and do things while you're listening. So
Sure.
It's all good.
Yep,
Well, I certainly do appreciate your time, guys.
absolutely. Thanks for attending, and reach out if you have questions, needs, whatever the case might be. We're here to help out.